The early generation of American heavy cruisers are an interesting bunch. Those ships, Pensacola and Northampton, had been designed as light cruisers, reflected by their initial CL designation, as well as their relatively light armor protection. They would later become heavy cruisers based entirely on the size of the guns and nothing else. Yet, despite this, the first pair, Pensacola and Salt Lake City, have become legendary for their durability. Those ships took everything the Japanese could throw at them and came back for more. As if that wasn't enough, post-war they would also, well, that's a spoiler. Stick around and you'll see what I mean. In any case, today's video will focus on Salt Lake City, Swayback Maru as she was nicknamed, a ship that engaged in one of the fiercest surface actions of the Pacific War, suffering some severe return fire in the process, before going right back in for more. She certainly defied the Tinclad moniker sometimes assigned to these early heavy cruisers, proving that light armor, while certainly a problem, is not necessarily a fatal one. Not if you have a well-trained crew and a stoutly built ship. But of course, we'll be getting to that later. For the moment, this is as good a time as any to look at that design and see what made Swayback Maru tick before we look at how she used what she had. For this, we'll begin with the displacements as per usual. In this case, around 9,100 tons at the standard loading. That went up to around 11,500 when fully loaded. That displacement went more to the weaponry than the armor, with this coming out to 2.5 to 4 inches, 64 to 102 millimeters on the main belt. Admittedly, far from the worst protected cruiser out there, yet still thin enough to initially warrant the light cruiser designation. As I said, that was due largely to a focus on firepower. I've noted this before, but with warships, and tanks for that matter, you have a trinity of main features: armor, firepower, and speed. With Pensacola, the Navy opted for firepower and speed at the cost of armor protection, with the main battery consisting of 10 8-inch 203mm guns. However, even here, there was a compromise. The slim hull necessitated fitting a unique turret layout, a triple super firing over a twin. This was repeated on both ends of the ship, coming out to 2 triples and 2 twins. Meanwhile, the secondary battery was more standard going forward, 4 5-inch dual-purpose guns, with initially 6 torpedo tubes and 2 triple mounts. Those would be removed, however, as the Navy mostly moved away from torpedoes on cruisers. In any event, that also brings us to the end of the design details, with the speed that reached just shy of 33 knots on 107,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts. And with that bringing things to an end, let's turn to the service history, which would start quiet but became quite exciting as the ship aged. This story began on June 9th, 1927, when Salt Lake City was laid down, in this case by the New York Shipbuilding Corporation, with a relatively fast construction period for peacetime work. The cruiser was launched on January 23, 1929, and commissioned on December 11th of the same year. The fitting out, in particular, was quite speedy. That said, Salt Lake City didn't properly enter service until 1930, with her sea trials running through early February. Nothing particularly out of the ordinary there. Something that continued into the initial service, which would see Salt Lake City visit Cuba and Brazil before returning to training off the East Coast. Pretty standard for an interwar cruiser, which were often used for port calls like this, though her crew were apparently particularly skilled, winning several awards, notably for the raceboat crew. However, aside from that, there wasn't much of note going on. The cruiser continued her training duty into 1931, when she would be reclassified as a heavy cruiser. That came on July 1st, 1931, in the aftermath of the London Naval Treaty, which established the 8-inch gun equals heavy cruiser system, and the similar 6-inch gun equals light cruiser thing. With the new designation in hand, Salt Lake City would continue on her peacetime work. Once 1932 rolled around, she shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific to continue her exercises just based out of California instead of the East Coast. This pattern would last through the rest of the 1930s, only really broken up by the odd long-distance voyage, such as, for example, visiting Panama, Colombia, and Cuba in 1939, or bouncing between Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and Guam in 1940. All of this was fairly typical, and there wasn't much of note setting Salt Lake City apart from her comrades. Not that this is a bad thing. Sometimes uneventful and average can be a good thing. It certainly made life easier on the crew. Either way, this rotation came to an end in August 1941 with a voyage to Australia. This was the last great peacetime voyage for USS Salt Lake City. As you can tell from the date, she wouldn't have much longer before war broke out. Or rather, war broke out for the United States. Salt Lake City had returned from her Australian cruise only to join up with USS Enterprise's task force. This group, including her sister Pensacola, sailed for Wake Island to drop off Marine planes and pilots as reinforcements for the island garrison. It was apparent that conflict with Japan was probably inevitable. It just wasn't clear how exactly it would break out. As it turned out, Salt Lake City, and by extension Enterprise, were lucky. That transport mission would keep the group out of Pearl Harbor just long enough to avoid the attack on December 7th, 1941. Enterprise, upon receiving word of the attack, would launch scouts to try and find the Japanese. Fortunately for the Americans, who were not ready to face the Kido Butai, they found nothing. The task force would enter Pearl Harbor on the 8th of December before promptly setting sail again for more searching. All they would end up finding was a pair of submarines. On December 10th, they found I-70 on the surface, where the submarine was promptly sunk by Enterprise dive bombers. The next day, another sub was sighted on the surface. Salt Lake City opened fire, forcing the boat to dive. Destroyers dropped depth charges as well, but seemed to have missed. At the least, no debris came to the surface. The same went for a third contact. With only one submarine to their name, the formation returned to Pearl Harbor on the 15th. After this point, Salt Lake City would shift to quieter work, though not for lack of trying. She was at first assigned to the relief force for Wake Island. When that plan was called off and the island fell, Salt Lake City swapped to escort duty, covering reinforcement convoys to Midway and American Samoa, something that kept her occupied until early 1942 when the cruiser sailed back to proper combat duty, specifically escorting Enterprise during Admiral Halsey's raids up and down the Pacific from February through late March 1942, with Salt Lake City, for her part, conducting shore bombardments of various islands, which was largely successful, although it drew Japanese attacks on the cruiser. She would help down 2 Japanese bombers during this, specifically in attacks on February 1st, where the ship's shore fire was noted as particularly accurate. These raids on Japanese holdings would ultimately culminate in one of the most famous air raids in history, the Doolittle Raid on April 18, 1942, during which Salt Lake City continued her work escorting Enterprise, and in this case, USS Hornet as well, as that group mostly avoided Japanese attention, patrol boats aside. It was able to safely return home, arriving at Pearl Harbor on April 25th, where a short break followed. Short because the group was promptly ordered to the Coral Sea to reinforce Yorktown and Lexington. However, they would arrive too late. By the time the ships could reach their allies, Lexington was on the bottom and Yorktown was damaged. Salt Lake City's group was hundreds of miles east of the action on May 8, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Because of this, the most the cruiser could do was cover the withdrawal of the damaged Yorktown, with Salt Lake City ultimately ordered back to Pearl Harbor on May 16th. All well and good, but it did mean she would miss the other big early war battle. The cruiser was based in Pearl Harbor for rearguard defense when the Battle of Midway took place on June 4th, 1942. A theme that would continue for the rest of the year, with one notable exception late in 1942. Before that exception, however, Salt Lake City was held back. When the invasion of Guadalcanal went through on August 7, 1942, the cruiser was occupied escorting USS Wasp. That would prove largely uneventful for Salt Lake City, not least because she wasn't present for the Battle of Savo Island on August 9th. In any event, Salt Lake City would remain with Wasp going into September of 1942, including, unfortunately, that carrier's torpedoing and subsequent sinking on September 15th. Salt Lake City would help in taking on survivors, but there was little she could do to help Wasp or hunt the offending submarine. That said, the cruiser would get some measure of revenge a month later, on the night of October 11th, 1942, during the Battle of Cape Esperance. This would pit 4 American cruisers against 3 Japanese cruisers, with 5 American and 8 Japanese destroyers supporting them. This battle would be a bit of a mess. I've covered it before in my video on USS Helena, which started the battle by opening fire without explicit permission. Normally not a good thing, but in this case it would surprise the Japanese, leading to a running gunfight that saw the cruiser Furutaka sunk, while the newer Aoba was shot to ribbons. The Japanese also lost a destroyer in the form of Fubuki. For her part, Salt Lake City would take 3 damaging hits while covering the battered USS Boise. Her own return fire is noted as accurate, contributing to the mauling of Furutaka and Aoba. In addition, the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships notes a fire from her scout plane, which was launched only for flares to go off in the cockpit, burning the plane out. Regardless of if that happened or not, the damage Salt Lake City suffered required repair work. She would sail home, spending quite some time in repair. 4 months, with the ship returning to the war in mid-March 1943. The Salt Lake City Association website gives the time frame of November 1st, 1942 to March 11th, 1943. 4 months and some change. Either way, when she did come back, Salt Lake City was sent north. She would operate out of Adak Island in the Aleutians to support operations against occupied Attu and Kiska. It was during this operation that the ship saw her second surface action, and by far the more famous of the two, at least in relation to Salt Lake City. This was the Battle of the Commandorski Islands on March 27, 1943. An American formation was on patrol duty off the aforementioned islands, watching for Japanese reinforcement convoys. This group consisted of Salt Lake City, the older light cruiser Richmond, and 4 destroyers. On March 27th, they succeeded in their goal of catching a convoy. A Japanese force of 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Maya, along with 2 light cruisers, Tama and Abukuma, plus 4 destroyers of their own. While the destroyers were more or less evenly matched, the cruisers were lopsided, 4 against 2. Unsurprisingly, in the resultant battle, Salt Lake City would draw much of the Japanese attention. Regardless, the battle kicked off around 8:40 in the morning on the 27th, the 26th on the American side of the international dateline. So if you see this battle listed as March 26th, that's why. In any event, the first shots came from Nachi, directed towards Richmond. The Japanese, trained for long-range gunnery, straddled the cruiser by their second salvo, even before the spotter aircraft was airborne. Though, to their credit, the crew of Richmond was nearly as good. They straddled Nachi in turn on their third salvo, at which point Salt Lake City opened fire with a straddle on her second salvo, only to start taking shell hits from the other Japanese cruiser, Maya, the first at 9:10, and then several more over the course of the next couple hours. The most critical hit coming at 11:52 when a fuel tank was punctured. The contaminated fuel proceeded to kill, if only temporarily, the boilers aboard the cruiser. Salt Lake City came to a halt, prompting the escorting destroyers to put up a smokescreen and make repeated charges on the Japanese to take fire off the damaged cruiser. This allowed Salt Lake City to restore power, though she struggled to go above 20 knots. It also cost the destroyers dearly, with Bailey, in particular, taking severe damage. On the other hand, the combination of the attacks and low ammo stock forced the Japanese to retreat, sparing Salt Lake City an even worse pounding. As for her gunners, they had fired 806 armor-piercing shells, and 26 high-explosive ones once they ran out of the armor-piercing rounds. It reached the point that the crew was carrying shells from the forward magazine to the aft one to keep firing, something like the reverse situation on Houston during Sunda Strait. At any rate, after the Japanese withdrew, Salt Lake City continued on her duty. Her damage was light enough to be patched up in theater, and she only left Alaskan waters in September, arriving at Pearl Harbor in October, where she was reassigned once more to cover the carriers during the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns. In particular, Salt Lake City would fire on Tarawa on November 19th through the 21st, following which she would do the usual late war American work, though more of a battleship than cruiser style. Instead of sailing around with the carriers, she would provide gunfire support during the Marshall Island invasions from January 9th to February 17th, 1944. Further work of this nature followed on March 30th and April 1st before the cruiser was detached later that month for a much-needed overhaul, with this running from May 7th to July 1st, 1944. Instead of sailing back into the Pacific when that was done, Salt Lake City returned to Alaska. She would remain there from July 8th through early August, though poor weather kept her from doing much, with the next actual combat coming on September 3rd with a bombardment of Wake Island, after which she would shell Marcus Island on September 9th. Pretty standard for this part of the war, albeit not in location. As for her next spar with the Japanese, that would be the Battle of Leyte Gulf from October 24th through the 26th. During this, Salt Lake City helped cover the carriers, thus missing most of the major action. On the other hand, she would be present for the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945, and the Battle of Okinawa in April and May, during which her gunfire support was highly requested. Her crew had earned something of a reputation over 1944 of being excellent shots, and they continued that trend in the final two major invasions of the war. That said, with no more fleet actions, Salt Lake City would ultimately round off the war, heading back to Alaska in August 1945. When the Japanese surrendered on August 15th, she was on her way north, with the cruiser diverted to Japan on August 31st to cover the occupation. When that was done, Salt Lake City would perform Operation Magic Carpet runs to bring men home. For most ships, her active story would probably end here. However, this old warhorse would instead be assigned to Operation Crossroads in 1946, where Salt Lake City would survive both of the atomic bombs, Test Able on July 1st and Test Baker on July 25th, 1946. Not only did she survive, the cruiser was still in good enough shape to be assigned for more gunnery target duty, ultimately being sunk as a target off California on May 25th, 1948. To my knowledge, the wreck of this tough ship has yet to be discovered. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.